Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Oh, it's not very good. Good evening, Mr. Burt. We'll try again. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Mr. Burt.
Oh, whack. You're not? All right. First of all, the warning. You can see it there. You will hear things that will shock you, and I can assure you of that. First of all, though, can I welcome Milton? 58 years ago, Milton and I started on the same day at Gawler Primary School. No, not Gawler, Rosedale Primary School. And then when Vidulis has moved into Gawler, I moved to Evanston. Poor old Milton moved to Evanston too. Guess what?
Had the same teacher.
Had the same teacher. He is the only person that I've taught for the whole 7 years of his primary education. And another one of my Evanston fellows over there is a bloke called Rob Chamberlain. And welcome, Rob, good to see you. And gee, the fellow that used to give us a lot of grief on Gawler East Primary School Council, Brian Samble. How are you, Brian?
Love you, don't worry.
Now, see how we go. Aha, you just need to go back one. We're in business. Right. We got in a bit of trouble just with the title of this. I started out by calling it Education as it were, because that wasn't grammatically correct. And then Rob put a thing in the bunyip, and I had a phone call from one of my former colleagues to tell me that the title was absolutely disgustingly insulting. That it is a consonant and it has no gender. And there are 33 recognised genders these days. And the correct consonant to go there is they.
Is that?
Now, having done a bit of English over the years and taught a bit of English over the years, I don't think words like it and they are consonants. When we were kids, they used to be pronouns, and they still are. So we've overcome that problem, and education as it was.
Hey.
Oh, sorry, education as they was. And I also argue with the fact that there are 33 genders, because last time I looked, I reckon there was 35, counting the ones that us people talk about, so there we go. I'm quite sure that some of those photographs there are familiar to some people. Some people here are old enough to have seen those sorts of things, but the old K-pattern desk, the first primer, the Pathfinder arithmetic books, the South Australian history readers. When I went to school, I used the same history reader that my mum used. When I started teaching, guess what? Same history reader that my mum used. Because history doesn't change, does it? The atlases were the same too. School milk. Who remembers school milk? Oh, the rules said you weren't allowed, the kids weren't allowed to have that school milk until morning recess time. And on a day like today, sitting with no refrigeration, wow, was not very nice. Okay. Before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the role played by our settlers, pioneers and migrants from all over the world in the exploration, settlement and development of our great country, Australia. Their tenacity and hard work enabled the creation of our prosperous, egalitarian, democratic society, which is the envy of the rest of the world. I'll also acknowledge that this was the land of the Kaurna people, but I believe that we should acknowledge the people who have made our country what it is today. Let's start our school day. The class rules, very, very simple. Sit down, sit up, shut up, listen up, and if you've got something to say, put your hand up. Simple as that. And if you don't obey those rules, well, the door's over there. I would ask those who are able to stand to please stand. And say with me, I am an Australian. I love my country. I salute her flag. I honour her King, King George VI. I promise to obey her laws. Thank you very much for the way in which you've done that. Somebody over here knows, you know, all the actions. So I've forgotten them. But that's the way we started every school day.
What, with that flag?
With the Union Jack. Yes. I must also say that due to the fact that Paul's an extremely good organiser and researcher, today is the 80th anniversary of the day that I started school. I started school 6th of February 1945.
History team timing.
Great history team. Well done. So, we usually have a reading too. Not from the book for kids by C.J. Dennis, but I thought it was appropriate. I'd like to be a teacher and have a clever brain calling out, "Attention please!" And must I speak in vain? I'd be quite strict with boys and girls whose minds I had to train, and all the books and maps and things I'd carefully explain, and make them learn the dates of kings and all the capes of Spain. But I wouldn't be a teacher if I couldn't use the cane. Would you? And of course C.J. Dennis is the equivalent of Shakespeare in South Australia. C.J. Dennis, born in Auburn, educated at Montero Primary School, and along with Banjo Patterson, probably one of our greatest authors and poets, and a great man. Okay, getting a bit serious. Education is so important. I made a living out of it for 40 years. Although literary rates have improved this century, there are still over 1 billion illiterate people in the world. Only one continent has a 100% literary rate. Anyone tell me what that continent is? Antarctica, yeah. Literacy is the ability to read, write, listen and speak in a way that allows us to communicate effectively and to make sense of the world. And anybody who reckons they can make sense of the world as it is today is better than I am. The essentials of reading. If we start from where the arrow is, that in itself is an interesting thing. Phonemic awareness. Now some people look at that and say, phone Mick. And I don't think Mick wants a phone call from me, so. Phonemic awareness is the ability to look at a word and say, yep, that's got a couple of syllables. This is the way we can work it out. You can then go on to the next, phonics, to work out what each of those syllables are and how they can be put together to make a word. That word then becomes part of your vocabulary. When you see it, you can read it fluently. That whole thing leads to comprehension. Now, not that long ago, so many people thought that if you looked at a word for long enough, you would know what it was. but not if you don't have the means to work it out. Phonics is so, so important. And we know that as of 2022, 14% of Australians are functionally illiterate and can't read a newspaper headlines, ads, or fill in forms or surveys, and 30% had literary skills low enough to make them vulnerable to unemployment or social exclusion. Now, there are some people who would say, yeah, 30 and 14 is 44. 40% of Australians have literacy problems. That's not quite true because the 14 are included in the 30. But for a country like Australia to have 30% who are not confident and can read newspaper headlines doesn't say much for our education system. Just imagine not being able to read what that says. The headlines from today's paper. I'm not going to read it to you because I'm quite sure that every one of you can read that. Just imagine what it would be like to be faced by something like that. Who can read that? Is there anybody who can? I'd love to know what it says. I don't think it'd be very nice somehow. So, reading, so important. Let's have a look at Australia pre-European times. Homeschooling was invented by our First Nations people years ago. They also established the first childcare centres. They were a hunter-gatherer nation, group, tribe, whatever you might like to call it. The men went hunting, the women went gathering. The 2 or 3 women stayed behind with their kids in the camp and looked after them. Today we call them childcare centres. In 1788 there were about 600 tribes and almost as many languages and dialects. Our Indigenous people had a very detailed, complex education system. They needed it. They lived from day to day, from hand to mouth, and depended on that knowledge handed down from generation to generation. And over the years, my respect and admiration for the real Aboriginal people has been enormous. And I'm not going to go any further on that because I could talk about it all night, and perhaps some other time. The early days of South Australian education. The first formal school was on Kangaroo Island and established for the settlers' children in the Pingin Bay in November 1836 by Captain Walter Bromley, a former army officer. South Australia was proclaimed a colony on December the 28th, 1836. And my friend Marg and I went to the 188th birthday luncheon of South Australia on the 28th of December last year. And we heard Dr. Brian Hickey talk about the establishment of the Anglican Church in South Australia. And not very many people can say that they've slept with some of the elite of South Australia, but partway through the address by Professor Hickey, Rod Bunton, who's the Governor's husband, was so close to falling off his chair that his wife had to give him a nudge in the ribs to wake him up. It wasn't very interesting. Initially, homeschooling was all the go. And then some of the churches came in and started making their own schools. And here in Gawler, one of the first was St George's, just across the road from the Anglican Church, where there used to be a tennis court. And now it's wall-to-wall houses almost. That was 1850. Going back a bit earlier, some of the teachers were paid per pupil. by the government. And those teachers received a magnificent amount of twopence halfpenny per person per day. And can I just sort of go right down to the bottom of my foot? Twopence halfpenny, 2 pennies and 1 halfpenny. How on earth can you phonetically work that out to read twopence halfpenny? Just imagine if you're someone who's come from somewhere like Greece and you're faced with that. Twopence halfpenny. Anyway, let's go on. However, the teachers were only paid if the kids were at school, so they chased them around to make sure they were. But then that was capped at £2 5 shillings per week. And when you look at it, if we take inflation and all that sort of thing into account, that's pretty much about the same as teachers get today. Not very much, undervalued, underpaid. In 1851, the government built some schools and supported others. Schools were built at places like Mitcham and North Adelaide, where there were people of means who kicked up enough fuss to have a school built. And while we're talking of people of means, you'd all be familiar with the word POM. Did you know there's 2 kinds of POMs? The POM originated because the convicts around the penal colonies in places like Sydney had on their uniform, or whatever they wore, shirt, P-O-M-E, Prisoner of Mother England. That's how POM originated. South Australia was the only colony formed without convicts. And so South Australian POMs are spelled P-O-M, people of means. Take a bow, folks. In 1871, a very brave man, 1871, a very brave man by the name of Ebenezer Ward introduced the Education Act to South Australia. That was put up at various times over the next 2 years and was eventually defeated by 2 votes in 1873. And one of the arguments against having free and universal education was put forward by one of the members of Parliament who said, "My wife taught my manservant to read and write so that I could leave him written instructions and he could improve himself." He repaid this generosity by taking a position as a clerk at a much higher wage and much shorter working hours. Who wouldn't? Being in a stronger financial position, he asked our maid for her hand in marriage, and we are now faced with having to clean our own boots, wash our own clothes, and sweep our own floors. That will be every gentleman's lot if we have universal education for the working classes. There we go. However, in 1875, 150 years ago this year, the South Australian Education Act passed. And the man who was pushed that was Ebenezer Ward, and he was rewarded for that by having a tiny little back street in the city named after him. You may have come across Ebenezer Place. Reminds me of John Tyndall, who translated the Bible into English and was burnt at the stake as a reward. We're great here. Anyway, the Education Act said that education would be free, compulsory and secular. And the idea was that the government would take over all the schools and those pesky churches could get their noses out of it. And the government could also get its hands on some of the land that those pesky organisations had got and built places like St Peter's College and Prince Alfred College. That didn't work. In 1878, the Gawler Public School, which was one of 8 model schools in South Australia, was opened. And the head of that school was Mr. L.S. Burton, who'd been the head of St George's School for 24 years. It was large enough for 600 students. And they used to jam about 100 into a classroom, no problems at all. The spread of public schools. When you have an Education Act that says that all children up to between 6 and 13 must attend school for, I think it was 90 days per year or something like that. Suddenly, the government was faced with, what do we do with kids out in the country? And by 1910, South Australia's population was about 220,000, and there were about 800 one-teacher schools scattered across the whole of South Australia. Many of those were in the settled areas and were about 6 miles apart. And if we were to look around here, there was Wasley's, Roseworthy, Anglevale, Gawler Blocks, which is now Everton Gardens, Freeling, Sandy Creek, Greenock and Lindock, plus others that have now closed: Kangaroo Flat, Gawler River, Luce, Stockport, Rosedale, Sheoak Log, Daveston and Uluru. There are also around about 1,200 larger schools, so round about 2,000 schools in South Australia in 1910. And whilst the government soon forgot about the free part, they enforced the compulsory part to its very, very letter. And inspectors and attendance officers wandered around the state, finding any kids who weren't at school were in trouble and their parents were in even more trouble. Some of those schools were not very inviting looking places. Just a few there: Daveston, Kangaroo Flat, Gawler River, Stockport. There weren't any lawns around them back in those days. They weren't very welcoming places. Teachers didn't really want to be there. And yet they seemed to have staff for all of them. Uluru School, by the way, has been turned into a museum, and it's open on Sunday afternoons, and groups of people are able to go there and have a look. And if you're interested in education in the way it was 100 years ago, go and have a look at Uluru. It's an interesting spot. Most of those places were, as it says there, in all sorts of out-of-the-way spots. No electricity, bad roads, no sewage, not very pleasant at all. People didn't want to be there. But the South Australian government were very, very resourceful. They actually gave secondary school children the opportunity to become teachers. And I was one of those people who, when I was 14, sold my soul to the South Australian Education Department. I was paid 10 shillings a month. Veritable fortune to continue with my education in what was then intermediate, now Year 9. And then 15 shillings a month when I did leaving certificate. And at the end of that time I was invited to go to Teachers College, and the wonderful thing was that all of my fees at Teachers College were paid both college fees and university fees. And I was paid the most magnificent amount of £5 per week. Now, £4 of that went on board, but I received a very, very good education, 2 diplomas and a degree, and the cost was the cost of a few textbooks. So it was an excellent system. However, there was payback, because that payback said, when you finished your training, you will have to spend 3 years working at a place or places decided by the education department. And if that place happened to be Oodnadatta, you went to Oodnadatta. And you could virtually trace people as they went out of Teachers College up the Broken Hill line, across the west coast and north from round about Jamestown. Of course, the other thing was that back in those days, South Australia also provided teachers for the Northern Territory. And one of my friends from Teachers College was lucky enough to win the Little One Teacher School at New Roodler. Now, New Roodler was a travelling school. It was the school that was established to educate the kids of the navvies who were building the railway line between Port Augusta and Lee Creek. And as the railhead moved north, so the school moved north. And my mate Normie found life pretty difficult. There was a room sort of attached, or a railway carriage attached to the school, which was where he lived. He didn't look after himself very well and he became quite ill. He was taken to Port Augusta and taken to Port Augusta Hospital, and they didn't know what was wrong with him. Taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, and they didn't know what was wrong with him. And then one day, a young Indian medical student who was studying at the University of Adelaide looked at Norm and said, "Oh, haven't seen this case of scurvy in Australia." And Norm became the only known case of adult scurvy in the whole of Australia during the 20th century. And that's about his only claim to fame. He wasn't all that smart. Okay. The famous long drop toilets. And the definition, of course, of a long drop is a pit with a bottom at both ends. And some of them are, I mean, they were, as it says here, smelly, unhygienic, great home for rats, mice, centipedes, snakes, redback spiders, and the design, you know, not the sort of thing that you take visitors to have a look at. The one down the bottom left-hand side with the red arrow is the one at Talawi, which is my first school. And the winds just blew the sand away from around the base of the toilet, and there was a gap there big enough for a cricket ball to roll down. And so one of the very special places when the kids played cricket was a fielding position called the poop. And if you let the ball go down there, that's where you were. There's also problems with snakes. My mate, who's known as Atomic Tom, when he first went teaching, he'd been to the country. He'd actually been to Freeling one day with his parents. That's the furthest away from Adelaide he'd ever been. And so when he went to Bangor, which is in the Port Germain Gorge, it was a long, long way away from home. And he had a brown snake down the toilet. And so he talked to some of the locals and said, look, the best way to fix that is to get some sump oil. Get a gallon of sump oil, tip it down the toilet, and that will get rid of the snake. Well, Tom didn't have a can of sump oil, did he? But he did have a can of petrol. So he tipped a can of petrol down the toilet. And as he was going back at the end of the day, he went past the school incinerator and thought, oh yeah, I'll put a match in that as I go past. So he went and put a match in the incinerator, went on his way, got in his car, and wouldn't have been 20 metres up the road, and there was an enormous explosion. The toilet was blown to smithereens. It blew out all the glass and all the windows on the southern side of the school. It made one hell of a mess. And from that day on, Tom has always been known as Atomic Bomb, because the explosion was without equal to that. Right. I thought you might like to know about my family in South Australia. My mother's ancestors, who were the Maynards and Overtons, came from Kent, and they arrived at Port Misery in 1840 and moved to Clare in 1842. I dare say you're all familiar with Port Misery. It has a different name these days. They call it Port Adelaide. There is a group of people who belong to the Pioneers Association of South Australia who would love to have the name Port Misery restored to that part of our suburbia, and their footy team renamed.
Funny.
The Burts, Charles Burt and family from Long Sutton in Somerset, arrived in Sydney in May 1858 and moved to Neagles Rock near Clare in 1860, and then to 3 square miles at Wirianda south of Hawker. And they were some of the pioneer people who bought that land up near the Flinders Ranges. It wasn't a very good move. They moved there, as I said, in 1878. By 1912, they just walked off their land because they couldn't grow crops, and the droughts just wiped them out financially. Charles's cousin Robert Burt and family moved from Long Sutton to Anglevale. They came via Port Misery too, and they went to Anglevale in 1864 and settled there. And there's a photograph of the family tomb there. We call it the Leaning Tomb of Anglevale. It's not a tourist attraction. Okay, the 1940s. We had the end of the Depression, the World War II, the Holocaust, catastrophic destruction of Europe and much of the UK, rationing, polio, atomic bombs. Women actually were accepted into the workforce. The rise of manufacturing, migration, the Cold War, post-war reconstruction and soldier settlements. And my father-in-law was one of 32 soldier settlers who settled the country between Port Macdonald and the Victorian border in the southeast. And only about a quarter of them survived. They just didn't get the support that they should have had. I spent my childhood during that time, and I had many disadvantages and afflictions. My family was different, and so was I. I wasn't delivered by the stork. My mum loved me so much, she carried me around in her tummy until I was born. And that's not the way most people did it, because the stork collected babies from the baby factory. And as a kid, I thought the baby factory was that great big building on the left when you're at Jepp's Cross, up on the hill. I think we call it Yatla these days. That's where babies were made, and the storks delivered them to various places, to the hospitals and the cabbage patches and the strawberry patches and all that sort of thing. And you always knew the kids that were sort of dropped off in the onion patch because they stank. That's the way it was. And sometimes the storks got lazy and dropped the kids down the chimney. And that's how you got black kids. All of my family could read and write, and that was different in the Clare where I was born. I was a very difficult baby because I wouldn't sleep. And 4 hours, 4.5 hours, 5 hours was about the most that I ever slept right through until I was about 50 years of age. And that was a great advantage to me in many ways because it gave me 3 or 4 hours more time in my life every day than most people had. But it must have been a curse for my parents who really didn't want somebody around yapping at their heels 18 hours, 20 hours a day. My mum was weird because she wanted to be a doctor. And the closest she got to that was to be a St John ambulance volunteer. My dad was weird because he wasn't tough and authoritarian like a lot of dads. He was a very, very kind person. In fact, he was so kind that he came up with something like that. Would you like to grab it, Paul, and let people...
Rabbit trap.
A rabbit trap. Yeah, careful, it's loaded.
Do you want me to pass it around?
Pass it around so that people can have a look at it. They were a vicious thing.
Yeah, I'll just show it.
It really upset my dad to think that rabbits were caught in something like that and the pain they suffered. So he built a different sort of trap which was like a bit of down pipe which went into a cage. And the rabbits went into the cage because there was some vegetable peelings or something like that there, and they could be dispatched in a humane way. And he also came up with that particular idea that Paul's showing around, and wherever he could, he would buy up rabbit traps, go to clearing sales and that sort of thing, buy the rabbit traps and weld them into the way that that's welded as a candle holder. And I always thought that was pretty smart. My grandparents were also pretty weird because they believed in book learning. And my grandfather Burt, well, he was a great character. Sitting down here, that photo was taken on his 90th birthday and he's reading the Advertiser. You'll notice he's not wearing glasses. He lived to 92 and he never bothered with glasses. And he was a character. He used to come up with all sorts of things like, don't shout help, shout fire. People won't come and help you, but they'll come and put the fire out. Very deep things like never ever argue with someone who's drunk or mad. Never ever argue with someone who knows everything. And then the one that I really liked and I quite often quote myself is, you can't expect respect unless you respect the person from whom you expect respect. And that has sort of gone with us. The other thing was that most people in those days had hanging above their bed a tapestry or something with a verse from the Bible or the Lord's Prayer or the 23rd Psalm or something of it. The thing that was hanging above my grandfather's bed was just one word. And it had been very, very carefully sewn by one of his daughters, and it said success. And as kids, my brother and myself and all my cousins and everything else, we were told success. If you don't do anything else in your life, succeed. Because the other thing is that my family, I think as parents, were great role models. I doubt that very many people were as good a role models. And lots of you, people who I know here, your family would have been great role models for you. But the most dreadful thing I had was the affliction of being left-handed. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The 1940s curriculum was something else. It was set out, and the people who made it up reckoned that it contained everything that anybody ever needed to know. And so, the 1875 Education Act decreed that all schools must follow the same curriculum. Lewes Primary School, with about 10 students, followed the same curriculum as Gawler Primary School, with about 600 students. Remote Nungi-Competa, and for those people who don't know where Nungi-Competa is, it's between Wirraloo and Mudmuckler. I'm quite sure you know where they are. Had exactly the same curriculum as Gawler Blocks and Sheoak Log. It was rigid. It was irrelevant to most students, it was repetitive, it was dull, and it was just plain boring, and a lot of kids hated school, and you can't blame them. The history and geography had a very strong British bias, and due to the imperial system, arithmetic was very difficult, reading resources were limited and far from exciting, and many of the words in the spelling curriculum meant absolutely nothing to country kids. Physical education was limited to skipping for girls, gymnastics for boys, and marching for everyone. And I brought along with me a couple of my father's books from 1917, a spelling book and a reader. And you'll notice the spelling book has still got its original brown paper cover on it. Who can remember brown paper covers? Yes. You'll notice that he did a couple of weeks of work in that, and then because there wasn't enough books to go around, each of the kids was given a memo book, and they did their actual writing in the memo book. And if you look at the reader, gee, I reckon that's boring stuff there. Nothing to get excited about. You're not going to stay up all night reading that particular book. That sort of thing. You know, the Adelaide Primer, the old arithmetic books, the history readers I've spoken about, and books like Girdle Round the World and Tales and Ventures from the Realm of Reading. Anyone remember any of those? Yep. Oh, good. Not very good at all. Okay, a little bit about my primary schooling. And as I said, 80 years today since I started school at Clare Primary School. My first interaction with the education department wasn't all that positive, and it wasn't all that good. I was born on November the 5th, 1938, and I was 5 years old at the beginning of the 1944 school year. My mother took me along to enrol me. Guess what? The headmaster took one look at me and said, take the little runt home and let him grow for a year. The big kids will kill him. What did mums do in those days? You didn't argue with the headmaster, so I spent a year at home. Actually, I didn't. It was probably the best thing that ever happened. I spent a lot of time with my old grandfather Burt. By the time I hit school, I could certainly read, I could write, I could do all sorts of things as a result of that. My first day at school wasn't very auspicious. About 10 minutes into the day, we were all given a sheet to colour in, and I'm colouring in in between the lines because I was pretty good at that. And next thing, whack. Across the knuckles of the left hand. And the headmaster picked up the pencil and said, "That's not the way you hold a pencil, son. You do it this way." And he stuck the pencil into my hand like that. And every time I picked up, he saw me with something in my left hand, I got whack. That went on for the whole of my first year. 3 or 4 times of the week, I would get a whack. And he was a very cruel and nasty person. He really was. He used to stand and he'd whack me and he'd say, "Cry, you little bugger, cry." Well, that wasn't going to happen, and never did happen. And when I got a bit older, used to kick the footy onto the roof of his house, which was next door to the school. Get permission. "Can I climb on the roof and get the footy, sir?" "Yeah, of course you can." So I climb on the roof, get the footy and pee in his rainwater tank. Yeah, didn't get on very well with the headmaster. My classmates, you can see there in grade 3.
Which one's you?
Top row, second from the right, alongside the bloke was wearing a tie. I wasn't very good at wearing ties, never have been. Amongst that lot, I can see Graham Barrett, who was Chief Inspector of Police in charge of Traffic Branch at one stage, Rob Sanders, who was a cardiologist, Doug Easton, who was a Telstra technician. Who else have we got there? Oh, you might remember John Sidney, the TV star, Brian Stone, and his name when I went to school with him was Brian Whetstone. And he had several different things over the years. A pretty average sort of group of people. The one little fellow in the second row, round about the middle, chubby face, Alan Richardson. Alan went on, he started medical training at the University of Adelaide and fainted every time he saw a drop of blood or anything like that. So he did psychology and ended up Professor of Psychology at Edinburgh University. I'm conscious of the time, Paul. How much have I got?
You're a little bit longer, you're good.
A little bit longer? All right. After 5 years of putting up with one particular principal, whose name I don't mention, things changed. We had a new headmaster came into the school, and his name was Mr. Fechner. He's over here on the right, and he was a fellow that always had a smile on his face. My dad thought he was great because my dad and he could sit down and have a red wine together and have a chat. He was kind to kids. He was just one of the nicest people that you could ever come across. And his youngest son was called Alex. And Alex was about 3 years older, 4 years older than me. And went on to be quite a good musician. And some of you may have heard of Walt Fechner, who used to play in the Adelaide City Jazzmen. And for years and years and years, they used to come to the village fair up here and play. And Walt was the clarinet player, and he died a couple of years ago. But just one of nature's gentlemen was Mr. Fechner. Years later, when I was at Stockwood Primary, guess who came along as Inspector of Schools? My old mate, Mr. Fechner. You should have seen the report he wrote on me. Oh, it was absolutely fantastic. All right, pushing on. So The 1950s were the time. Wow. Did you know that smoking's so good for you? As a young teacher, all young teachers were encouraged to smoke because it settled the nerves. And you'll see there on the, hang on, we're going the wrong way. The one on the right hand side, I'm going to grow 100 years old because I'm going to smoke Camels when I grow up. These were scientific facts. And here are some interesting scientific facts that you may not be aware of. You've probably heard of some of it. Get more sun, get more tan. Wow. No flies on me thanks to DDT. Oh, safe to use. I can remember being at Glenelg and seeing that truck going and misting, sending DDT around everywhere to kill the flies. DDT is good for me. You can drink it, you can bathe in it. It was just fantastic stuff. Didn't do anybody any harm. And then, of course, there was the wonder mineral, asbestos. It was so good, they even made asbestos suits for kids. Wow. And then, the wonder morning sickness drug thalidomide. Wow. William McBride was the doctor, Australian doctor, who linked thalidomide to birth defects. And over 10,000 people were affected. And the sad thing is that later on in his career, Bill McBride was never ever forgiven by the big pharmaceutical companies and by some of his colleagues for what he did. And his reputation was ruined. You might have heard about Devenox. Anyone heard of Devenox? Which was, as far as I can gather, almost as bad as...
There was one Devondox.
Devondox, was it?
I had that one.
Yeah. And it didn't upset everybody, but it caused a lot of trouble. But Bill McBride was charged with, what was it? Falsifying his research work. Cost of things. Loaf of bread, 8 cents. Pint of milk, 8 cents. Pound of sugar, 9 cents. Butter, 39 cents a pound. Potatoes, 40 cents a pound. Tea, 65 cents a pound. Petrol, 8.6 cents a litre. Wow, they were the days, weren't they? The old Brian Sample used to be able to burn around in his vehicle. Yeah. And the Holden car, £2,200. How things have changed. The 1950s to me were, wow. 1951, 1952, Clare High School in Adelaide, Teachers College 1956, and part of that was University of Adelaide, Wattle Park Teachers College, and in between that, 3 months of national service. So in 6 years I'd gone from being a first year high school student to a qualified teacher and a very, very highly trained and efficient killer. And boy, in national service in those days, they didn't muck around. It was hard going. One of the best things that ever happened to me, I then spent 5 years in the Adelaide University Regiment afterwards, and the contacts that I made there and the people that I knew as a result of that, just incredible. So, to my first school, to Lowy Creek Primary School. Lovely park-like surroundings in a lovely little village. Down the bottom you can see the whole town there, school on one side of the road, church on the other. Drift sand everywhere. The kids had the biggest sandpit in the world. Puff of wind and the dust came up. There were times when you couldn't see the kids in the back row. Not the most salubrious place to go and learn. Had 3 Aboriginal children there. One of them would rock in any time between 9 o'clock in the morning and midday, bring his 7-foot spear with him, walk into the room, park it in the corner, sit down and go on with it. And as he went home at night, he'd take the spear with him, and if he happened to see a rabbit or something like that on the way, well, that was tucker for the table. Just imagine today what would happen if a kid walked into a room with a 7-foot spear. Wow. Lots of kids, interesting, as you can see, magnificent facilities, wonderful building, that very, very well maintained, roof nicely painted and downpipes all in good condition. Wow. We used to make a fortune out of pushing people out of the drift sand. Dave, the mailman, used to come through every day around about 3 o'clock. He'd always stop and drop the mail bag off. Then he couldn't get going again, so the kids would come out and push. You might notice the little fellow standing there away from everybody else. His name was Clarence. And Clarence was very, very shy and was very, very easily upset. And when he was upset, he would fart. And I can't use any other word than that. He would fart long and loud and very, very smelly. And Inspector Gibbs didn't know that when he came into the school and sat down alongside of Clarence and decided to see what his maths was like. 3 times 2. Clarence goes, 5. No, son, that's 3 plus 2. 3 times 2. 1. No, that's 3 minus 2. 3 times 2! Well, Clarence let fly. It was long, it was drawn out, it was spectacular. And poor old Alfie Gibbs was blown away by the performance. And I'm sort of, cool, what's he going? When he wrote up his report at the end of the day, he said something like, the teacher is to be admired for his patient approach to one boy who is particularly sensitive. Dear. I enjoyed it. I boarded on a farm with the Williams family. I still keep in touch with the Williams family. And being from the country, I could drive a truck, I could drive a tractor, I could change a tyre, fix a float valve on a trough, lubricate the cogs on the windmill if they needed lubricating. I could cook a meal, and more importantly, the paperwork. I was paid the most incredible amount of £2 a day. £14 a week. I could go out and shoot a couple of foxes and get £4 in 10 minutes. Because foxes in those days, there were so many of them. And the farmers would pay you £1 for a tail, and then the Department of Agriculture subsidised that with another £1. And Jack Williams and I used to go out every Wednesday night, and our best night was 23 foxes within a couple of miles of where they lived. So the school itself, pretty hard going. Kids in those days, you had polio, mumps, measles, rubella, chickenpox, whooping cough, tetanus, tinea, school sores, boils, conjunctivitis, tonsillitis, you name it. And I can remember when the nurses came round to immunise the kids against polio, and it's as close to a riot as we ever had. Wow. I'm going to leave it there because I think I'm pretty much out of time.
Another 5 minutes, do you reckon? Or
One more? Okay.
Go,
I'll quickly whiz through
more tales.
more. Yeah, I've got to have a go at this bloke. We'll just whiz through some of these. Stockwell was where Anne and I first went when we were married. Both of our children were born when we were there. Great place. The old non-decimal currency. Wow. Try using a calculator to work out £7.15 and 9 halfpenny plus £9.12 and 7 pence. Or worse, dividing £43.17 and 6 by 13. It just doesn't work. Just doesn't work. Look, this I think's a doozy. Grammar and composition were important components of the English curriculum. Daily diaries were all the rage and so on. And the one that I tore out and kept amongst my stuff. Dad bumped Mum and Mum said, "If that makes a bruise, I'll show the parson." Dad smacked her bum hard and he said, "Show the parson that bruise." And of course, like a good teacher, you'll see the red marks with the spelling errors. Sadly, at about that time, things like spelling and grammar declined, and the focus shifted to that wonderful thing, the new math. Charlie Brown, I think, said it all. How can you do new math problems with an old math mind? And Milton would remember this. Attribute blocks and Poisson-Aire blocks all over the place. We didn't really know what to do with them, but they were there and the kids had fun playing with them. We had Venn diagrams all over the floor, and we had Dr. Dean's, Professor Dean's wonderful blocks, and if you looked at them long enough you learnt your tables. How many of you can say your 8 times tables? Yeah, most people. At Clare Primary we had to learn our 13, 14, 15 and 16 times tables because there were 16 ounces in a pound. I was always very glad that our headmaster didn't realise there was 63,360 inches in a mile. Was pretty tough times. Oh, the one down on the bottom corner here is a new math thing that my wife, who was an art teacher, did with a group of kids. Nobody knew what it meant, but it looked bloody good, didn't it? Rosedale. One of the nicest places and one of the nicest group of kids you could ever wish to come across. Despite the massive curriculum changes like the new math, the abolition of phonics for reading and spelling, grammar's fall from grace, self-directed learning, and the abolition of all competition, not much changed at Rosedale. District Inspectors Colin Lecornu and Harry Clark were happy with the status quo, and the lip service approach that we made to those things. Results were good. As long as results were good, they were happy, and the results were good. Overseas educators actually came to have a look at our flexible approach to curriculum change, and they were impressed. I don't know why. The old K-pattern desks disappeared, and we got some much better desks. Carpet appeared in the library. The TV found its way into the porch. And Rhonda Noack was appointed half-time teacher because our numbers, I think, were 37 at one stage. And because we didn't have the space, Rhonda and I team taught in the same classroom. And that came back to bite me on the bum, believe me. Television was supposed to be the end of children. The old, the maths, wow. This one, simple maths, 17 plus 26. Let's have a look at it and see if we can get this to work. No, not going to work. It's supposed to be a movie. We'll keep going. All sorts of stuff went on. The result of that new maths was an incredible decline in mathematics. So there it is in the form of a graph. And it's only in, around about 2010 that started to pick up and go on its way. One of the things that papers that I wrote was to allay the fears of people that TV was going to make their kids idiots. And so I wrote this paper called Eating With, and you might be able to just see the little with in the middle, Eating With Children. People who looked at it and didn't look at it very carefully were absolutely horrified. Eating children! Oh, goodness me, what's he? And about 10 years later, I found that published in the American Journal of Education by Professor somebody or other, who just pinched the whole thing, changed the spelling in it and the wording to Americanisms, and there it was. We call it plagiarism, but the Americans are pretty good. Kids at Rosedale. Can you pick Milton?
No, you better not.
You got hair there.
Yeah. Milton is second from the right in the second row up, with lots of hair.
Third from the right.
Third from the right, sorry. Yeah. And
Thanks for that.
you'll notice something else too. Every one of those children are in uniform. And I think that was a real retrograde step when they virtually abolished uniform. Group learning and that sort of thing was just the sort of thing we did in those little schools. Kids not facing the front, working away. Oh boy, did I get into trouble when I threw out the inkwells and gave kids biros. If the death penalty had been in vogue, I would have been hanging from the old gum tree, believe me.
Why was that?
Oh, you just had to have dippy pens and inkwells.
What, to dip ponytails in?
Yeah, all sorts of things like that. Really was a great place to work, and some of my best friends go back to those days, and amongst them are students. I'd catch up with Milton's older sister, Mary Anthony, from time to time, and lots of other people. Caught up with Rod Zirk the other day, and so it goes on. Just from there, I went to Evanston Primary as the coordinator of the 4-teacher open space unit, which was another failed education disaster in South Australia. It should have worked, it could have worked, but that building there had 4 classes in it. It was built to accommodate 130 students because they would fit. the maximum amount we had in there at one stage was 180. The windows didn't open because there was air conditioning, but that air conditioning couldn't cope with 180 students. And the whole thing was an incredible failure. Just very quickly through, Michael Jacobs not here tonight, but his wife Sandra is third from the right in the second row there. Robbie's here. He wasn't in that class, he was in a different class, in the smarter kids classes.
I thought you meant the naughty boys.
Yeah, Robbie and Rosie, and both in the same class. From there I went to Sandy Creek and to the regional office. It was in the Whitlam era of the Schools Commission, laissez-faire approach, do what you wanted. There's endless innovations, millions of dollars came pouring in. Open education, outdoor education. I can remember working in the office, and it's the first time I've ever held a cheque for $1 million in my hand. And this cheque for $1 million came from Canberra, from the Schools Commission. And it was to buy library books for all the schools in the area serviced by the Elizabeth Regional Office. Now, it took time to work out how much money went to each school. We had, I think Elizabeth High School at that stage had about 1,200 students, and Vinevale Primary had 7 or 8 students. Obviously you just couldn't divide by the number of schools, so while we were working that out, that $1 million had to go into a bank account. And I went down to the Savings Bank of South Australia, down at the bottom of the Elizabeth Shopping Centre, and the young lady at the counter said, how can I help you? And I said, oh, I need to open a special account. And she said, oh yes, we can do that, and gets the paper. How much do you want to put in it? I said, $1 million. And she looked at me and she said, ha ha ha, very funny, very funny, you're joking. I handed her the cheque and she said, oh, I think we better see the manager. Well, that cheque caused so much trouble. It took about 6 weeks to work out how much money went to which schools. And back in those days, interest rates were 17 or 18%. And that money just made interest. And the rules said that we had to distribute that $1 million across the schools to within plus or minus $10. Well, I think there was something like $27,000 in interest had accrued. And I phoned Canberra and said, what happens with this $27,000 interest that we have? Oh, that's your problem. Not a bad problem to have. So I spoke to our boss and he said, oh, I reckon we could do with some new crockery and cutlery in the staff room. Eventually we gave it to Barcuna, and Mark knows a bit about Barcuna. Mount Pleasant Primary, once again, there's 104 kids in Mount Pleasant Primary School. We thought it would be nice to take them to Victor Harbour for a week's camp. And so I phoned my friends in Canberra at the Schools Commission and said, look, I'm in this really remote country school, the kids have never seen the sea, we'd like to take them to Victor Harbour for a week. And the young lady I spoke to said, oh, that's a lovely idea, how much do you want, $5,000? And I said, oh, that might just... I said, I'll make it 10. And so we went to the Salvation Army camp there, spent a week. There was 102 out of the 104 students went along. We had the whole staff, we had 17 parents came along to help out. We hired canoes, we hired instructors, we hired fishing gear, we went fishing, we went swimming, we went canoeing, we did all sorts of things. and there was still money left over at the end of it. Did I say 2 buses, 2 drivers? Nobody ever bothered to check what had happened to that money, and it just disappeared down the bottomless pit. Ventero. I must share with you the story of John Patrick O'Neill, who's there in the middle of the bottom. At Ventero, I did a deal with Mrs. Mortlock, who's still alive and living there, to go down into the cellar at Martindale Hall and get out some of the stuff that was there. And you can see it on display here, all sorts of Aboriginal artefacts, animals and stuff that was just sitting in the cellar. And a couple of parents and I would go down each Christmas holidays and get the stuff. And we'd often look at this box sitting over in the corner. And so one day we brought it up, and there's a little plaque on it that said John Patrick O'Neill. And when we opened it up, took the brass screws out, guess what was inside? John Patrick O'Neill. And the story of how John Patrick O'Neill was a shepherd who'd worked at the station and just disappeared. Well, shepherds did that in those days. Nobody really missed him, but then 4 or 5 years later, they found the skeleton in the bottom of a dried up dam. And the belt buckle was used to identify John Patrick O'Neill. Now, in 1970, whatever it was, the only thing you could do was to phone the local police and say, this is what we found. Well, they were about as interested as I am in paying extra tax, and said, ring the coroner. So we rang the coroner, and the coroner sent a couple of people who came out, had a look and said, oh yes, remains of a white male, the belt buckle's there, obviously somebody had identified him somehow, his name's on the thing. I said, what do you want done with him? Well, that's up to you blokes. So Dr. John Wallace, the local GP, Dick Wilson, the flying vet, and Peter McColl, the local pharmacist, got 2. And John Patrick was put together for display in the school library. And on the first day of the school year, the kids thought it was absolutely marvellous. And the local people came and introduced themselves to John Patrick, and it was absolutely fantastic. And then about 6 o'clock, I got a phone call from the school cleaner. Get that bloody thing out of here! He goes or I go! Well, Anne and the 2 kids helped me carry poor old John Patrick out of the school library and up into our house, and he sat in the lounge for a couple of days. And then the boys came in and disassembled him, put him back in his box, and as far as I know, John Patrick is still resting peacefully in the cellar at Martindale Hall. Gawler East is a story in itself. Paul was one of the foundation students here, along with Michael Jacobs and another one. So Brian Samble was very much involved with building a new school there, and that in itself is a story, a hell of a story. Just in closing, education is Gawler and District's main industry, with over 10,000 students in over 20 schools, both state and private, plus early learning centres from Roseworthy campus through to Anglevale. The growth of educational facilities has been phenomenal and shows no sign of slowing down, with thousands of new houses being built. With excellent resources and the gathering momentum to return to common sense teaching, the future of education is bright, but there's a very, very long way to go. The public system could learn so much from the many excellent private schools that we have, and schools, governments need to give education so much more support. And just some of the very latest in textbooks, and on the right, a very, very effective book, The Direct Instruction Method, Practical Guide to Effective Teaching. I'd love to get a few teachers reading that, especially if they're teaching my great-grandchildren. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a great class. Schools are places where children go to learn. We must never lose sight of that. And Mark Twain, I have never let my schooling interfere with my education. Thank you once again. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. Just while we've got a chance, are there any questions that we'd like to ask Brian?
I just want to ask Brian how he taught year 1 to 7 in one room altogether. I don't know how you ever did that. You must have done so much preparation.
Oh, look, it was honestly a 60-hour-a-week job.
Yeah.
The secret was teaching a group, setting them written work to do. But that created enormous amounts of marking.
Yeah.
So it was just go, go, go. I have here a gift that was given to me when I left Talawi by the Aboriginal people. And that can be...
Just go ahead and pass that
yeah,
around.
pass it around. Each and every one of the people in the Baruta group were involved in making that. And it was made with a couple of chisels, one the old semicircular chisel, the other one just a flat chisel, rocks and stones and that which they used to grind. And then the markings burned on with a piece of red hot wire. So, all done.
Look, thank you very much, Brian. That was absolutely spectacular. A good part of the education of early Australia that's been good to see from the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s. I appreciate it. And on behalf of the history team and all our guest members, I'd like to present you with a gift. At the moment, we have this very special. It's the Gawler History Team magnets. So
Put that on the fridge.
Yes.
Oh,
So
wow.
just thought-
Thank you so much. That is great.
So once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.